It's Crisis Night here in Athens, and tonight we'll be covering the Franco-Prussian Crisis, prequel to World War II. Let me introduce you to some of our actors. I will be now introducing the major players and explaining a little bit of why I selected each actor to portray this character. The first that we have is Napoleon III, Emperor of France. Now, as you can see, he's a strapping fellow, but he's got an odd pallor. I chose this character because Napoleon III had iffy health during a majority of this crisis, which resulted in him relying a lot on his French foreign minister, Agénor de Gramont, and he was also very insecure. He was really worried about public opinion at the time because any negative public opinion reflected poorly on the regime that he represented and the republic that he was in charge of, the Second Republic of France. So he was, all in all, an unsure actor. He was very, very wary of any threats to France's prestige, and he was definitely against German unification because he enjoyed the current French hegemony that was happening. Now, next up, I know that you think that this is his French foreign minister, Agénor Duc de Gramont. However, this is his first French foreign minister, Napoleon Comte d'Aroux, who was a pacifist and actually would have been a lot more helpful in this situation. However, he got fired almost at the beginning of the crisis, and we got Agénor de Gramont, a fiercely anti-Prussian man who ended up escalating a lot of the crisis because he was so wary of possible German unification. So this is France. That's their side. Okay. Next up, we have Spain, which has a multitude of actors. First up, we have Queen Isabella, who was the ruler of Spain, but was overthrown in September 1868. So Spain brought in two provisional rulers, Serrano and Prim, to find a new candidate for the throne of Spain. Now, the one that they selected, after going through all the candidates once and having them all refuse, was Leopold Hohenzollern. Now, I selected this guy because he looks grouchy and reluctant, which are two things that Leopold Hohenzollern very much was. He was a Prussian prince, and while he didn't mind being offered the candidacy for this throne of Spain, he wasn't particularly excited about becoming the leader of a major world power, and he was also unsure as to the effects that would have on him and his father's relationship with other major leaders. Next up, we have Otto von Bismarck and William I. Now, Otto von Bismarck was a highly influential member of this crisis. He's the German chancellor, and he was the eventual mastermind of German unification. He did a lot of behind-the-scenes work in this crisis. He was kind of sneaky. One of the main things that he did was to publish the EMS telegram from William I, which pissed off the entirety of France, as it was supposed to do. That was his intention. He released it, weirdly translated, so that it would be as insulting as possible to the French and make them want to escalate the conflict, which of course, being the French, they did. Now, next up, we have William I. Now, this is the King of Prussia at the time during the crisis. He's an ascetic, stalwart, military ruler. He had to be convinced by Bismarck of the advantages of having Leopold, a Prussian prince, on the throne of Spain, but once convinced, was confident that he could best France's military easily, which he ended up doing. Now, I chose these two characters because, well, he's a commanding presence. But he's a pirate, and pirates are also sneaky and usually only loyal to themselves. Now, he is standing in front of William I, because even though William I is still a very strong ruler, Otto von Bismarck did a lot of the operations in this crisis, and so he is kind of the main representative of Prussia in this crisis, and acted on behalf of William I. Okay. This crisis truly begins with Otto von Bismarck's sponsorship of the candidacy for the Spanish throne of Leopold Hohenzollern, the Prussian prince. Bismarck really wants this because he thinks that a Prussian-Spanish alliance would be really healthy and really good for his future plans of unification of Germany. He has to work kind of hard to convince William I that this is a good idea, but William overcomes his original misgivings and allows Bismarck to go ahead with his diplomatic mission. Bismarck does his best to make sure that nobody in France has any idea that he wants Leopold to become Prince of Spain. He's hoping that nobody finds out until the Spanish courts have a chance to vote on it and officially declare Leopold candidate and solidify their alliance. However, due to a mistake in a telegram, in which July 1st was written as July 9th, everyone politically becomes aware of the fact that Leopold Hohenzollern is applying for the candidacy of the Spanish throne. Now, obviously, the French are furious. Look at them. So angry. Angry about it. They're horrified because they know that a Spanish-Prussian alliance would effectively mean the end of the French hegemony that was currently happening in Europe. So on July 9th, when the candidacy was unintentionally made public, despite Bismarck's greater attempts to keep the candidacy hidden, especially from the French, the French's first response officially was to inquire, officially, whether or not Prussia was involved in this candidacy. Now, of course, Prussia denied this. They're old hacks at this game. They know what to do. This was seen as a slap in the face for France, however, because it was widely known that the Prussians were involved in this candidacy at this point. So denial of this was seen as an insult to French prestige, which the French do not stand for. France responded to this by sending a blockade of diplomatic initiatives to Prussia in order to block the candidacy, while also taking a strong public stand that this sort of disrespect against French prestige would not be acceptable. I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce poor little Benedetti. He was used as the French envoy in a lot of these interactions, and he was basically a puppet of Gramont, this aggressive anti-Prussian guy right here. And he did a lot of interacting with King Wilhelm I, and he also did a lot of interacting with Leopold Hohenzollern's father, Karl Anton, who was just a general mover and shaker in Prussian politics. During this period, Bismarck continued to reaffirm Prussia's non-involvement while being content to enter into a conflict, as he felt it would help unify Germany, rally around the flag effects. France, meanwhile, believed the opposite. They believed that the conflict would divide Prussia from Germany. So going into this crisis, both sides think that there isn't really a downside. France is hoping that Prussia will be destabilized, and Prussia is hoping the exact opposite, while also hoping to destabilize France. And both of their militaries are telling both of these, well, king and emperor, are telling both of these leaders that their militaries are unmatched and that they will be completely ready to handle any potential conflict. Now, as time progressed and Prussia continues to claim that they were not in any way involved with Leopold's candidacy, Wilhelm continues to echo what Bismarck is saying publicly. However, privately, he admits to not only Benedetti, but also Karl Anton, that he had misgivings about this candidacy from the start. Sorry, Leopold. And he was angry that Bismarck had created an entire incident involving the Hohenzollern house, which was also the house that William I himself was from. However, he and Bismarck's problems in their bedroom, and the conflict continued. Wilhelm I did this, knowing that this would likely cause a conflict with France, but he was fed up at this point. He didn't want to take any attacks on Prussian prestige, and he was also hoping to escape French influence in the following conflict. Now, Bismarck went a step further. He published the EMS telegram that detailed Wilhelm I's refusal of the French request. However, He chose to publish the version of the telegram, translated for the French, most likely to enrage the French public and government. Oh, and boy did it. Now, during all of this, Leopold Hohenzollern himself decided to absent himself on an alpine walking tour. He was out of communication for a majority of the time. Now, because of this, his father, Karl Anton, strong leader, was doing a majority of the negotiating between him, Benedetti, and Wilhelm I, as well as Gramont and Napoleon III, ostentatiously. Now, he chose, on Leopold's behalf, to renounce the candidacy for the Spanish throne because he was upset about the conflict. He did not want the smoke. He did not want to be involved in this crisis. And he also didn't want any bad attention attached to the name of Hohenzollern. Who would? Now, his renunciation was seen as, well, it was perceived as the end of the crisis. By Wilhelm I, he said, a stone has been lifted from my heart, because he was so excited that the crisis was over and that he didn't have to do anything about it. However, just as they thought that the crisis was ending, subsequent French demands created, if not a new crisis, a continuation of the crisis. Now, I misspoke earlier detailing the EMS telegram. Bismarck did send a communication that the king asked him to send, detailing his refusal and continuing conflict. However, the EMS telegram wasn't published until the 14th of July, after Karl Anton had already renounced the candidacy, and after people already thought that the conflict was dissipating. The telegram was published, and it exacerbated still frayed tempers and effectively set up the conflict. Now, prior to this, as I mentioned, the balance had appeared to be tilting away from the war, although the French's continued pursuit of Prussian humiliation in the face of advisable diplomatic action underlines what the leadership was like at the time in France, which was uncollected, disorganized, and a little petty, very French. This, of course, is reflected in the behavior of France during the crisis, their pursuit of a Russian apology, and furthermore, a Russian statement that they would never interfere with the candidacy again, even after the renunciation of the Hohenzollern candidacy, shows how truly petty they were during the time of this crisis. Bismarck's actions, additionally, were extremely petty, though very motivated by his own desire to unify Germany. Because of this, their collective actions as a whole classify this solidly as a Type 2 bargaining crisis, a strategy without bargaining. They're in this category because throughout the crisis, they do remain rational actors. Never at any point did they start acting crazy or making absurd demands, given the context of the situation. However, they do, both sides, demonstrate themselves to be not that interested in bargaining and completely comfortable with an inevitable conflict, because both believed that their individual military might would sustain them in any sort of conflict. As I mentioned previously, conflict sparked specifically after the EMS telegram was sent by Bismarck, exactly what he had hoped would happen. War was declared, and the armies began getting ready. The fighting began. Now, the army of Napoleon III, though he had been told were more than prepared for any sort of conflict, were in fact ill prepared, as many as their troops were in their colonies at the time. Examples can be seen in Algeria, Vietnam. The French troops simply weren't ready. And then, exactly what Bismarck had hoped would happen began happening, in that as French forces began to invade South German states, these South German states put their trust in the Prussian army, and France suddenly found itself faced with a united Germany, never before seen, something that they had not really considered as a possibility. The German forces gradually pressed the French army back into eastern France, and gradually a large section of the French army became encircled in the city of Metz. The French public was alarmed at this and demanded the lifting of the siege. A large French army was assembled in advance to break the German siege at Metz. However, they suffered a catastrophic defeat at Sedan, and the battle decided the war in Prussia's favor. Now, France had lost most of its army and was defenseless before the German army during this conflict. During the battle, Napoleon III was even captured by Prussian forces. Even though he was captured, the war continued, and the French refused to surrender. He ended up abdicating while he was captured, and he was replaced by a government of national defense who carried on the war, eventually, after devastating defeats, agreeing to a peace treaty with the newly created German Empire. The Franco-Prussian War was overall a resounding victory for the newly unified state of Germany. Germany was united under Prussia after the war and was the largest and most populous state thereafter, especially considering the crushing defeat that France had just suffered at their hands. Eventually, Germany withdrew their forces from most of France, although they did annex and keep the French provinces of Alsace-Lorraine as une petite prise. Now let's talk ramifications. In terms of immediate ramifications for the French, Napoleon III's handling of the crisis throughout and his subsequent capture during the war meant that the Second Regime was completely undermined, and the Third Republic was instituted in France. That's ramification number one. Now, the second is that they had to pay around $1 billion in reparations to the Russians. So that's $1 billion that the French used to have that now the newly unified Germans have. So they're doing great. The last ramification is a little more long-lasting. It's their love of revenge, in particular for the Prussians. Now, this crisis set the precedence for their policy choices and their interactions and alliances with other actors in Europe and with Germany itself for the next couple of decades. Now, in terms of ramifications for the newly unified country of Germany, they were unified now, and so they were much, much stronger than they had been before. Additionally, their fierce militarism during this conflict laid the stepping stones for a foundation as an imperialistic giant in Germany's future. In terms of some longer-lasting ramifications to Europe as a whole, Germany's emergence as the most powerful state in Europe changed the balance of power in Europe completely in the decades that followed. Germany had replaced France as the leading nation to continental Europe, and under Bismarck, Germany continued to establish good relations with Russia and Great Britain, securing their position as a major European power. However, the growing power of Germany in the following decades eventually caused the formation of two opposing alliances in Europe, which was major foreshadowing for World War I. To summarize, this crisis, as I mentioned previously, is a Type 2 crisis, bargaining without strategy. France's pursuit of Prussia's subordination, even after the withdrawal of the Hohenzollern candidacy, as well as Bismarck's actions throughout the crisis, classifies it solidly as strategy without bargaining. It's strategy without bargaining essentially because throughout, all of the actors remain rational. However, they're not interested in bargaining, and while they do their best to avoid any direct conflicts, any direct advances toward a conflict or a war, they're also perfectly all right with the inevitable war or conflict that will occur if they continue pursuing their actions, because both sides relied on their own individual military might to sustain them in any following contact. Now, France, during this crisis, overall, was a picture of instability, between the power and responsibility for the crisis oscillating between Gramont, his French foreign minister, and Napoleon III, who was sick and then captured during the crisis. This was a real source of instability throughout the crisis because there were two different leaders that were contributing contributing responses to all of the questions being asked by King Wilhelm I and by Seurat and Prim for the Spanish candidacy. Now, another sign of instability of the French government during this crisis is the government's rejection of diplomatic bases in its pursuit of Prussian humiliation, as well as public opinion overall throughout the crisis being placed at higher importance than overt moves against the regime. As I mentioned before, any bad public opinion at the time reflected poorly on the emperor, but even more poorly on the regime. They had an especially cutthroat press at the time, which was on the lookout for any potential political misdoings. Napoleon's subsequent defeat during this crisis demonstrates exactly the sort of impression that public opinion can have on a regime. Immediately after he was toppled and a new government was taken over, the Second Republic was thrown out and the third one was started. The public wanted a new government after that. Now, as opposed to France's picture of instability overall, Prussia was quite the opposite. This conflict demonstrated their stability and their capability, both through the I don't want to say improved, but through the much better communication between Bismarck and Wilhelm I, as well as their overall military might. Bismarck was the wild card, however. He was the thing in this crisis that was pushing it forwards and escalating it, which doesn't seem particularly stable. However, he was fueled not by a desire to humiliate France, but by a desire to see a unified Germany. This was his overall goal. He pursued it rationally, and at the end of this crisis, lived to see it achieved. Thank you for joining us for Crisis Night. I'm Emma Atchley. This is Otto von Bismarck, and I hope to see you again. Everybody standing up? Okay. I would like to now introduce. No, okay, redo. What did? Okay, what you did?